Welcome everyone to Whimsy Woven Stories. Here, we explore gripping tales of real-life twists. Join our storytelling community.
I have a twin brother named George, and we grew up incredibly close. Understandably, he and I have been best friends for as long as I can remember. Growing up, we would do everything together, from playing small pranks on our families to playing video games late into the night after our parents would fall asleep. He was my buddy, and we would share everything, our secrets, dreams, and even the same sense of humor that only twins can truly appreciate. I remember, initially, when we joined the school, we were often mistaken for each other, which we would sometimes use to our advantage to play pranks. Our classmates and teachers would constantly get confused with us, which would make George and I just laugh at them harder. We played on the same sports team, helped each other with homework, and even had the same group of friends, so we were around each other constantly. It was like having a built-in best friend in my family who understood me better than anyone else. Our bond wasn't just about fun and games, though. We were there for each other through the tough times too. When our parents were going through a rough patch in their marriage, George and I would lean on each other for support. I remember our parents would fight constantly, and their disagreements kept escalating to the point where it became so abusive that I would often have to step in to protect our mom from our dad. Dad hated that I took Mom's side, but I didn't care. George, on the other hand, was very much scared of Dad, so he would try to keep his mouth shut as much as possible in these situations, avoiding any confrontation. Our dad was an intimidating figure, especially when alcohol was involved. His drunken rages were something out of a nightmare. He would return home drunk late at night and stagger around the house, breaking anything that came within his reach. The shouts and curses would echo through the walls, a constant reminder of his unpredictable temper. Anyone who dared to come close risked getting hit, as his anger often turned violent. I have lost count of the number of times I witnessed him passed out on the couch, reeking of alcohol, with a dark stain spread across his pants where he had pissed himself. It was a disgusting sight that became disturbingly familiar to us. George and I lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing what would set him off next or how bad the damage would be. If Mom ever protested against his behavior, Dad would start yelling at her relentlessly, berating her until she would succumb to crying. I vividly remember the times he would throw her food on the floor or in her face, screaming at her about how she couldn't cook like his mom. He would complain about how dirty the house was and accuse her of not being good enough for him. He would drag her out of the house and threaten to throw her on the streets while she would scream for help. We lived in one of those neighborhoods where other people would see everything going on but would keep their noses out of others' business since they didn't want to interfere between it. But even if they would have called the police, I doubt our mother would have filed a complaint against our dad since she didn't have anywhere to go and was so used to being treated like that. I never really understood why my dad was so harsh on her, since my mom really did her best as much as she could with what she had. She worked as a part-time server as well as took care of me and my twin full-time. All her paychecks went to our dad since he refused to let her have her own bank account, as he wanted to take care of the finances around the house. Dad did nothing to help us around the house except terrorize us. Just because he paid for our rent and amenities, he would constantly remind us about how we lived under his roof, so we had to listen to him, otherwise he would kick us out to the streets. As a child, I felt paralyzed and didn't know how to react to his explosive outbursts. However, as I grew older, I began to find my voice and the courage to stand up to him. I would ask Mom to retreat to her bedroom before Dad came home drunk, so she could be away from his wrath. I would then take on the task of serving Dad his dinner myself. If he ever threw the plate of food away in anger without eating, I would refuse to serve him again, no matter how much he yelled at me. When he threw things at me in his fits of anger, I would deliberately refuse to clean and leave the mess on the floor, so the next time he walked through the house barefoot, he would accidentally step on the debris and injure himself. I thought, with time, he would become stronger and better. However, when George and I became teenagers, I started to notice slowly that he began behaving a bit more like Dad, especially around girls our age. He would make derogatory comments to our female classmates, saying things like they shouldn't waste their time and study, and that they belonged in the kitchen. These comments would irritate me, but I tried to chalk it up to him trying to be funny, so he could fit in and be well liked by our classmates. I also noticed that people generally invited me to parties and would later invite George only if I reminded them. I guess George noticed this too and thought being funny and saying sarcastic remarks would make him look better. Unfortunately, his comments started to grow increasingly sexist. One time, at a birthday party, he called one of my female friends a fat kitten and told her that no one would ever marry her if she stayed fat, and that guys would just sleep with her and leave her. He tried to laugh it off after the comment as if it wasn't a big deal, while my friend had tears in her eyes. I felt so terrible for her that I mumbled an apology and dragged my brother out of the party. I was furious and yelled at him for being such an embarrassment in front of everyone. George argued back while laughing, saying I shouldn't get so worked up over a joke and that he was just pointing out the obvious. I told him, firstly, that it was rude and that he had no right to say such mean things to anyone, especially on their birthdays. But he insisted he was just being funny. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "No one laughed at your comment, so who did you think you were being funny for?" He grew quiet as I went on to tell him that it was pathetic of him to put down women, especially since that was exactly what our dad did to our mom every day. In my anger, I spat out to him how much I hated him for being so similar to our dad. I knew I had crossed the line because he glared at me with a smirk. He replied, "Well, maybe I don't mind being like Dad. At least he knows how to keep women in line." His tone was dripping with defiance, as if he didn't see any issue with his behavior, making my blood boil. His words infuriated me, showing just how much he didn't grasp the damage he was causing by acting this way. Later, when we reached home, since I refused to take him back to the party, Mom sensed something was wrong from my sullen expression and asked if we were okay. I didn't hesitate to tell her the truth because I couldn't understand how George could behave this way. Even Mom agreed with me that George had crossed the line and reprimanded him immediately, telling him to never speak to a woman like that again. He just scoffed and told her to mind her own business and go back to the kitchen. It was shocking to see my brother act this way. I was so pissed that if my mom hadn't held me back, I would have punched my brother right then and there. It was the first time I felt nothing but disappointment for him, the same feeling I felt whenever I looked at Dad. I wish I could say that George grew out of this phase over the years, but unfortunately, he never did. I think this is why he and I started to grow apart and were no longer close friends. I couldn't understand his hatred towards women for no reason and didn't want to be around his toxicity. I stopped including him with my friends and their parties, and everyone else immediately dropped him too. I guess this must have pissed him off even more, to realize just how much people didn't actually value his friendship. During this time, our parents' marriage was still deteriorating. One day, I remember I came home to a sight that is forever etched in my memory. My mom's uncle had passed away, and she had gone to attend his funeral. Since George and I had exams, we couldn't go with her, and Dad was never one to accompany Mom anywhere, so she had gone there alone. After finishing my exam, I headed straight home to study, while George probably had something to do because he wasn't home when I arrived. As I walked into the house, I immediately sensed something was off. The living room, where my dad usually napped and watched TV, was unusually quiet. I heard a noise upstairs from my parents' bedroom and made my way up the stairs to check out what the noise was. When I opened the door to their room, I was met with a horrifying sight. There, on the bed, was my dad with his secretary, both completely wasted and in the midst of doing the deed. They looked out of it and didn't even notice me standing there with the doors wide open, completely oblivious to the world around them. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Anger and disgust surged through me all at once. This was the man who was supposedly our father, the man who constantly berated and belittled Mom and threatened to kick us out, now shamelessly in bed with a woman in his very house. I mean, he could have done this anywhere else, but he had knowingly brought this woman to our house to disrespect our mom in the worst possible way. I quickly turned around and left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt sick to my stomach and couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. As I waited for George to come home, I sat on the porch, trying to calm myself down. When he finally arrived, I pulled him aside and told him everything, hoping he and I could confront Dad together. George, surprisingly, didn't look as shocked as I thought he would be. I stopped and asked him why he wasn't reacting at all. His eyes moved around before he finally opened up, revealing that he already knew Dad had been seeing the secretary behind our backs and sometimes even brought her home when Mom wasn't around. Stunned, I asked him how he found out and why I'd never seen her before at our house. George explained that Dad usually brought her over when we weren't around, but once George had apparently caught him. Dad had tried to justify his disgusting behavior by telling George that men sometimes have needs and that he should not say a word to anyone else since no one would ever understand. Since then, George had kept it a secret, allowing Dad to bring the secretary around whenever we weren't home. I guess it was some sick fantasy or power play for my dad to bring another woman into the house and sleep with her. George went on to admit that he had no idea Dad would bring her over that day, but if he did, we should make a ruckus and should keep this information to ourselves. Hearing this, I was both infuriated and heartbroken. I couldn't believe George had been complicit in hiding such a betrayal from Mom. His willingness to protect Dad's secret felt like a deep betrayal to me and Mom. My voice trembled with fury as I berated him for not protecting Mom and for allowing Dad's deceit to continue unchecked. George's face turned red with anger, and he yelled back, accusing me of always trying to be the perfect son and acting like the hero of the family. He claimed he just wanted to keep the family peace. The argument escalated as I told him this wasn't about me being a hero but about standing up for what was right and protecting Mom and us. I accused him of being complicit in Dad's betrayal by choosing to hide it rather than confront the issue. George pushed me back, insisting that I should not utter a word to Mom and that if I did, this would lead to our parents' divorce, and he would blame me for the rest of his life. He continued to tell me how these things sometimes happened and that I should turn a blind eye to it. This only made me more furious, and my heart pounded in my chest as I told George the first couldn't even look at him right now. I felt so utterly disgusted that I realized not only was our dad a hypocrite and a cheater, but my brother, who I had always leaned on, was willing to turn a blind eye to such a glaring wrong. As the anger and disappointment welled up inside me, I decided I wouldn't let this continue. I wouldn't let Dad's deceitful actions go unchecked, and I wouldn't let George's misguided loyalty protect such behavior. This was a turning point, and I knew I had to stand up for what was right, even if it meant confronting my own family. So I told Mom everything when she came back home. Even though Dad and George tried their best to shut me up and threaten me as much as they could, I didn't hesitate to tell her the truth. Dad tried to defend himself by saying I was making things up, while George stayed quiet out of fear. But Mom knew I would never lie to her. She already looked exhausted from grieving her uncle and looked like she would pass out after hearing this news. She simply started to pack her bag silently and asked me and George to do the same. Dad started yelling at her, demanding to know what she was doing, while I rushed into my room to pack all the important things I could remember. George stood frozen, still unable to process what was happening. When Dad tried to snatch my mother's things from her hands to stop her from leaving, I wrestled them away from him. His face turned red with anger, and he raised his fist at me. However, before he could strike, my mother suddenly slapped him across the face. The resounding sound echoed around the room, and Dad was momentarily speechless. Until then, my mom had never raised a hand on him. Mom then turned to us, her voice firm despite her exhaustion, and said, "We're leaving now." I quickly finished packing, but George refused to come. He stood by Dad and said he wanted to stay with him. Mom's eyes filled with sadness, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, told him she loved him, and that he was welcome to move in with us whenever he was ready. And we left Dad's house that day. It was a turning point for all of us. Fortunately, Mom had received some money from her uncle who had passed away, so the first thing she did after we moved out to a motel was open her own bank account so she could then cash in the check. This money from her uncle gave us a fresh start in our lives and allowed us not to go back to Dad. When Mom finally divorced Dad, she took half of everything he owned while he begged her for mercy, saying how he had worked hard for everything and she should not be so greedy. While Mom and I started a new chapter in our lives, George made his choice to stay with Dad. Despite their divorce, Mom tried her best to stay in touch with him over the years. Once or twice, he did come over for dinner at our place, but he and I would always end up fighting, as he would continue to blame me for our parents' divorce. He would tell us how Dad was depressed because of what I did and how I had broken up the entire family. Mom would do her best to calm him down while telling him how it wasn't either of our faults and that Dad was the only one who was responsible for everything. When I eventually went away to college, I met my wife, Kim. She was the kindest person I had ever met. Up until her, I had always been afraid of falling in love, as I did not want to be hurt like my dad hurt my mom. But Kim exceeded my expectations. Long story short, Kim and I have been married for the past few years. She knows about my relationship with my family. She knows exactly how my dad betrayed us and how George always supported Dad. Last year, my dad passed away due to a heart attack. This was not surprising to anyone since he basically drank himself to death every night. When Mom and I attended Dad's funeral, along with my wife, George yelled at me in front of everyone for being a bad son and having the audacity to show my face at the funeral. To be honest, I didn't even want to be there, but I had gone there for the sake of my mom, who felt we should pay our respects to the man. I was already emotionally charged up, hence when George came closer with his face all scrunched up in anger, yelling and berating me for something that I had done years and years ago, which he didn't have balls to do, I punched him in the face out of spite. All the family members from Dad's side already knew why George and I had been fighting for all these years. They mostly agreed with me, so they didn't even try to stop me or help my brother. However, Mom berated me while my wife held me back. I am generally not an angry person, but I was just so tired of being kicked on for everything that our old man had done to us. While I walked out to calm myself down, my wife and Mom talked to George and asked if he was okay. I don't know what George told them, but after the incident, on our ride back home, my wife told me how I should not have done that to my brother, who was already suffering. I snorted at her and asked her if she was serious. She looked at me gravely, telling me how my brother was going through grief and not everyone can be so emotionless about their dad's death like me. Her words hurt so much because she was the only person besides my family who knew exactly the kind of things I had gone through at the hands of my dad. All the years of toxic behavior, manipulation, and threats from him had made me not care much about my old man's death, yet here was my wife blaming me for not crying about my dad passing away. After that incident, even though my wife never apologized for her words, I thought everything was still fine between us. However, lately, this year, I've noticed some subtle odd behavior from her that has made me worried. She seems more distant and preoccupied, often lost in thought during our date nights. Sometimes she hesitates before responding to me if I ask her a question about our future, as if she's weighing her words carefully. There have been a few occasions when I've caught her wiping away tears in the washroom, though she always insists it's just stress or something minor. She's also been spending more time on her phone, often quickly locking the screen when I enter the room. I've never checked her phone, so her behavior seemed really sketchy. Our conversations have become less spontaneous and only happen when I initiate it. I feel like there's a wall between us that wasn't there before. Even during intimate times, I've sensed a certain detachment, like her mind is elsewhere. While she still maintained our routine and tried to keep things normal, these small signs were hard to ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was bothering her, something she was not sharing with me. It made me worry about our relationship and whether there was something deeper going on that I was not aware of. Hence, I wanted to go all out and do something nice for my wife, so I decided that for our upcoming anniversary, I would throw her a grand party. I sat her down and excitedly told her my plan. At first, she seemed unsure and tried to tell me how she didn't want any celebration, insisting it wasn't a big deal. However, a few days later, she suddenly changed her mind and enthusiastically told me that she thought it was a great idea. She mentioned wanting to invite even more people since it was rare for us to throw such a grand celebration. I immediately agreed. I assumed she was making a genuine effort to strengthen our marriage, and I was genuinely happy for us. The party was going well, with lively conversations and laughter filling the air. My wife looked genuinely happy, mingling with guests and ensuring everyone felt welcome. It was refreshing to reconnect with my cousins and distant relatives after such a long time apart. Some of my cousins from my dad's side were also there, adding to the warm atmosphere of reunion and celebration. Hence, imagine my shock when I saw George walk into the party. I knew for a fact that I had not invited him, so I assumed my mom might have and asked her about it without trying to create a scene. However, Mom was just as confused as me and denied ever inviting him. I then saw my wife approach George and greet him with a kiss on the cheek, which made me pause in my tracks. It struck me as odd because I didn't even realize they were that friendly when they had met for the first time only last year during Dad's funeral. My wife noticed me looking at them and immediately looked away, whispering something into George's ear. He glanced at me and smirked. Anger burned on my face. I walked towards my wife to confront them and to ask her about what was going on, but she suddenly clinked the glass to get everybody's attention. People turned to look at her as she stood there holding George's hand. At first, there was confusion, and some took a step back. Although George and I were twins, I had grown out my hair, and while I kept our original blonde hair, George had dyed his brown. It was evident to everyone that my wife was holding my brother's hand, not mine, which was weird and confusing for everyone to witness. Without missing a beat, my wife proceeded to announce that she was so happy that everyone was there since she and George wanted to announce that they were pregnant. The crowd fell silent, and people stared between me, my wife, and George, trying to comprehend what was happening. I stood there dumbfounded, my mouth hanging open in disbelief, refusing to believe what I had just heard. My mom loudly asked if this was a prank that my wife was playing on us because there was no way this could be true. George then went on to say how Kim and he had been having an affair for quite a while after she connected with him online when Dad passed away, and that they had eventually fallen in love. He boldly announced how Kim had been unhappy with me for years, claiming I couldn't satisfy her enough, and expressed that he was just rescuing my wife from a loveless marriage. I was stunned into silence, my mind struggling to process the betrayal unfolding before me. The crowd was silent at first, but then slowly people began hurling insults at my wife and George. Their voices were filled with anger and disappointment. Each and every one of them looked disgusted and creeped out. Some shouted accusations of deceit and betrayal at my wife, calling her a cheater and a hag, while others expressed sympathy for me. Clearly, my wife had not expected this reaction, and she looked like a deer caught in headlights. I was just so embarrassed and still confused about everything that was happening. I felt my chest tightening with everyone staring at us. I looked at my mom, and she immediately knew I was going to have a panic attack and knew she had to get me out of there. We walked out amidst the continuing insults hurled at George and my wife. Kim tried to run after me, apologizing for breaking the news to me that way and pleading for me not to leave her alone with such animosity, especially since she was pregnant. She told me that she needed me to publicly accept her relationship with my twin brother so that only then could other people give her their blessings. Before I could respond, my normally composed mom turned red-faced and screamed at my wife that what she had done was unforgivable and that her child would never forgive her for being such a characterless mother. Tears welled up in Kim's eyes as I simply laughed, agreeing with my mother, and left her there. Since the disastrous party, Kim has been reaching out to me, begging me to talk to my relatives as everyone has been texting and calling her to express their anger over what she and George have done. However, I have refused to help her in any way since she decided to do this all on her own during our anniversary party shamelessly. Update 1. Yes, I will be divorcing Kim. There is absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. Also, I have a prenup with her, so she cannot take a penny from me whatsoever. I am currently staying with my mom, and I have asked Kim to move out of my house within the week. Honestly, I have no idea why she and my brother started their affair exactly, but the reason doesn't matter anymore. At the moment, I cannot be with someone who can betray me this way. I have not told any of my family members to back off from them because I feel George and Kim deserve all the backlash they are getting. They are grown adults, so they can deal with this fiasco on their own. Update 2. It's been 7 months since my last update, and I have finally divorced my cheating wife Kim. Her lawyer tried to sue me despite our prenup, but there was nothing really they could do thanks to our state's law. Since she had openly admitted that she was pregnant with my brother's baby, she could not even hold me responsible for child support. I didn't even spare a glance at her throughout our divorce, even though she tried to beg me to be more understanding about what she had done and how she just fell in love with my brother. As for George, the coward hasn't shown his face to me or tried to confront me after the party. Just like our dad, he doesn't have the balls. Update 3. Hello everyone, it's been a long time since I last updated here. I have sold my previous home and have now moved into a much more lavish place, which is convenient for me as a bachelor. Since a lot of you have been asking, Kim did give birth to her baby with George, and they now live together. Unlike me, my brother can't afford to give her a great life, hence, she now works along with taking care of the baby. My brother is exactly like our dad, who drinks and passes out on most nights, so he's basically an absent father. If you're wondering how I know about all of this, it's from my cousins from my dad's side, who George reaches out to supposedly borrowing money from them because he's unable to keep up with the expenses. Mom has cut off all contact with him and has blocked him from everywhere, so he can't go to her for help either.
Thanks for listening. Share your opinion in comment section and also do like and subscribe to the channel.